out in the lands of danger and flame. Heroes of legend are making their name. Swords and spells with hearts full of zest. They ride with pride on a quest of interest. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Mystic lands and monsters to face. They're saving the world at a breakneck pace. From the Verdant province to Dragon's Lair, wicked wizards and trolls beware. With the rogue a knight and a mage so wise, they'll outwit danger and claim the prize. Legends told round campfire flames of secret spells and forgotten names. A hidden power, an ancient key. The fate of the realm is their destiny. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Curses, traps, and mysteries deep. No dragon's hoard is out of reach. They laugh at danger, they don't play it safe. Each wild adventure's a tale of interest. A caress. Heckfire Club, tales of interest.
We find our party today at the altar of the Unbound, having just witnessed dark and strange magics at work, exacting answers from the brother Malkesh, fallen cleric of the Unbound Brotherhood. The pain had not left him, but the trembling had dulled to something manageable. He bid them wait, his voice ragged but insistent, as he staggered to his feet, thanking the gods again for his sight, though it was clear the price had not been small. Slowly, reverently, the brother made his way to the altar, fingers dragging faintly along the etched stone. He reached behind a dark curtain near its base, revealing a hidden cavity filled with relics, half sheltered from time. There were scrolls bound in cracked leather, fragments of bone carved with divine sigils, and stone slabs inked with runes worn half to dust. His hands sifted through the remnants, searching, not for power, but for something recorded. Something remembered. Friz was transfixed. She leaned forward instinctively, her eyes darting from one sacred scrap to the next, wondering which held truths lost to scholars for centuries. Zora, beside her, tightened his grip on the edge of the altar, less out of reverence than concern. Zirath crossed his arms and let out a breath that was barely a sigh, his patience for riddles and relics beginning to wear thin. Finally, the brother turned and placed something in Friz's hands. It was an old children's book, thin, worn, and crudely bound. Friz blinked, turning it over, confused. Brother Malkesh did not explain. He merely bowed his head and excused himself, the tremors in his limbs worsening with each step. He returned to the altar and lay beside it, whispering prayers to gods both known and nameless over and over again, calling to those who still might listen. The party left him to his quiet pain and prayer. As they made their way through the underground, Friz flipped through the book. It was a tale from the East, as best she could gather, a local one. The book itself was very old, hinting at the age of the story itself. The book read The Cockatrice and the Barn Owl. Friz read on as they walked back to the entrance of the sprawling underground. Listen close, little one, and I'll tell you a tale of a bird who thought herself bigger than the sky. A tale of a lesson paid in blood and mud. Long ago, in a farm older than the trees and the fields and maybe even the grass, there lived a cockatrice with feathers of fire and eyes like glowing embers. Every morning, as the sky turned grey with the first breath of dawn, she would stretch her wings, throw back her head, and let loose a mighty crow, and every morning the sun would rise. As the seasons turned, she began to wonder, was it she who woke the sun? The thought curled in her chest like a spark in dry straw. She tested it. One morning she waited, holding back her cry. The sky darkened longer than usual. Was the sun hesitant? Afraid? Only when she finally crowed did the golden light return. Yes, she thought, I command the dawn. The other animals heard her words and began to believe. The bull, hard-working, snorted in agreement. The family of sheep, the herd of cows, even Keeper, the old farmhound with a coat of dusk and scars from long-forgotten battles, could not deny what he saw. But there was one on the farm who did not believe. High in the rafters of the barn where the dust hung in the moonlight, an old owl watched and listened. His name was Sage, and he was older than the farm, older than the trees, older than the grass. I have seen the dawn before you ever open your beak, he hooted one night. The sun does not heed your call. It rises because it must. The cockatrice fluffed her burning feathers and laughed. Then let the sky decide. And so, little one, the two great birds rose into the heavens in search for the truth. The cockatrice beat her wings, rising higher, flames trailing from her tail like a comet. The owl followed, his dark form a shadow against the stars. The animals below tilted their heads to watch, their breaths held tight in their throats. The cockatrice reached the peak of the sky and opened her beak, ready to summon the dawn as she always had. But before she could, the owl's claws struck, raking across her beak, sealing it shut. She thrashed, she screamed, but no sound came. And in that silence, the sky brightened. The sun rose, golden and indifferent. It had never needed her. It never even noticed her. And that little one was the worst wound of all. The cockatrice faltered, her pride torn from her like a broken feather. Down, down, down she fell, fire flickering from her wings, until she landed in the filth and the mud, her burning feathers quenched, her golden eyes dimmed. The animals gathered round, peering down at the once mighty bird they'd believed, as she lay shivering in the muck. Without a word, she spread her wings and flew away, her shame trailing behind her like smoke. And though the sky still burns red some mornings, and though the wind sometimes carries the sound of distant angry wings, she was never allowed back to the farm. Remember this, little one. The sun does not rise because we tell it to. The world does not turn for our pride, and those who try to hold the sky in their beak will only find themselves drowning in the mud. Friz put away the book, deep in thought. It was morning when they left the underground. Brother Malkesh, finally visited, had given gifts and precious information, though some still frustratingly cryptic. They had been down there nearly 3 days now. They talked and decided on getting cleaned up at the hotel and then paying the local offices and vaults of Harken Bank a little visit. Thomas would dress the part and take some of the gauntlet winnings to curry favour. Celia and Zora would wait by the door as Thomas's retinue, a term Thomas used. Friz would get in the longest line, there to help with a handy spell. Zirith was outside, keeping an eye out for trouble. The plan was set and the first caper was underway. The Harken Bank of Tannertown sat like a fortress disguised in refinement. Its alabaster facade glimmered beneath the late sun, smooth white stone rising without blemish or mark. Broad steps led up to golden doors, flanked by polished columns and crowned with a single name etched above the arch: Harken. The crowd outside parted into rive. Each line moved at its own pace, a slow wade toward bureaucracy, and it was easy to tell which line one belonged to. The cut of the cloak, the stitch of leather, weight of ring. Many clients, it was noted, were out-of-towners here for the tourney. There was a sense that the place had more money than it was used to, with lines reaching the back of the lobby. The play started the moment they stepped in. Thomas, flanked by Zora and Celia as his supposed, though quite apt, muscle. They stayed behind by the door, along with a few other rather imposing people, clearly also escorting others. Friz had found a place in the longest line and set up shop with the common folk. She had turned the owl signet ring on her hand inward, as to not draw unwanted attention. Thomas stepped into the line that didn't wait. He'd concocted the sad demise of his great step-uncle Beaufort, and the tale came together by the time he reached the counter. He scanned the room, every breath prepared for the wrong gaze, a rival con, a loose acquaintance, a former mark. But no one there could recognize him. Across the lobby, Zora and Celia's focus was between exits, looking for bank guards. It was so far good that they hadn't seen any patrols indoors. In fact, when they scanned the bank and found no hints of proper guards anywhere. That was not at this point exactly comforting. In the slower-moving lines, Friz stood alone, studying everything. Behind her spectacles, she looked like an idle academic. But she was searching. There was no way Harken Bank would not have defences against the very thing they were trying to do here. The teller, polite, asked how she might help the gentleman today. The teller blinked when Thomas said he wasn't yet a client, and placed a rather full bag of coin on the counter, weighty, loud. It had exactly the effect he'd be hoping for. The teller, instantly following protocol, offered to bring the manager, and Thomas smiled with expectancy. From their vantages of the bank, Friz, Celia and Zora noted the clerk leaving their station in front of Thomas and moved to an polished wooden door down a hall to the left of the building. The teller knocked and someone visibly annoyed answered, and the teller pointed in the general direction of Thomas. She was linen and leather, all tailored precision, beaming a theatrical smile. As she approached, Thomas saw it shift the moment she laid eyes on the coin. Charm unfurled as she offered her hand, her name, and a private office for new business. As they walked, Thomas caught the insignia stitched into her boots, leather Larry's work. That turned into idle talk of cobblers and local tailors, a brief detour into regional tanneries that bought him a few precious seconds. A small private room revealed itself off to the right of the offices. The small talk kept going as Thomas was offered a seat. When he turned, he saw the first possible hiccup. The door of this particular room was clearly warded, likely layered in subtle glyphs and quiet gears that hummed underfoot. It sealed behind them with a hiss and the grind of old magic. The room had no windows, and suddenly the noise of the outside bank disappeared. He was alone, and the others didn't know it. Back in the slow-plodding line of common folk, Friz adjusted her glasses. She would test her theory and let the spell unfold slowly, delicately, a whisper of intent beneath the clamour of coin and conversation. She let the spell settle like a thin mist. Abjuration shimmered beneath the walls, likely near the vaults, steady, cold and distant, but it was the thrum of divination that tightened her throat. The bank was, in effect, listening for something. Zirath outside noticed them first. 2 men in deep-cut wool and soft shoes stepping onto the plaza. No guards, no fanfare, just quiet, composed power. He recognized them both, Harken Bank's chief comptroller from Central City, accompanied by another Central City banker. They spoke in hushed tones, in no great rush, and took their time walking past him, not sparing him a glance. Zirath scanned the scene, and something wasn't right. No retinue, no protection, no steel. Anywhere in the world, including the oddly ordered Tanner Town, people who represented wealth always had muscle. Something was amiss, but he couldn't put his eyes on it. Back in the lobby, Zora nudged Celia as they spotted the newly arriving Central City. They'd seen them before at the Tawny Grounds and the Velvet Fang Hotel. Luckily, they clearly hadn't recognized them, including Celia, who'd won some acclaim in the ballroom. Friz, Celia and Zora saw the same spectacle. Mid-sentence, a bank clerk froze and nearly leapt over the counter, rushing past a stunned out-of-town client to get to the Central City bankers. All smile and grovelling, the clerk offered the bankers the office of the Tannertown location's chief financier as they waited. Curt nods punctuated overly friendly and welcoming small talk from the clerk, who bid the bankers only wait a moment. He'd fetch the manager most immediately, and was visibly sweating. Inside the small private chamber, Thomas eased into the chair and made up a name for himself. The room was cosy, tastefully expensive, and altogether fortified. The manager poured him something amber and aged, and he continued his tale. Tragically, Thomas said, his uncle Beaufort, late-stage gout, and a pile of inheritance too delicate for travel. She smiled with interest, but her eyes were already calculating. She simply offered that many Harken Bank clients came into new money in all kinds of ways, and that the oldest and most prestigious financing institution in the province welcomed all manner of new profitable business. Thomas understood they were now in the business of double talk, inside a sealed and silent room, behind a veil of hidden intentions. That spoke volumes of the security measures and practices of Harken, and confirmed one thing. This bank would take gold from all sorts, including shoddy stories of newfound wealth. He brought up bonds, long-term yields, asked how a man of means might make his coin grow alongside Tannertown. The question was perfectly formed to ask about the Darkwood Road. The manager's expression tightened just slightly, and the air in the room cooled by a few degrees. She mentioned that Darkwood infrastructure was the latest venture, a road and bridge between Tannertown and Tinborough, in which citizen could see 7-to-1 yields over the long term. Harken Bank could offer bonds long-term and low risk against the bridging of the great river to the north. Thomas rolled the dice and Flint's name entered the conversation. The manager didn't confirm or deny, she reminded. Harken prized security, discretion, and above all, silence. Her tone never shifted, but the boundary was drawn. Thomas was about to make his next move until someone knocked. Hard. The manager rose, annoyed, apologized, and worked the levers to get the door opened. She was whispering something curt to the sweaty teller at the door, then pivoted back, sugar-sweet, and apologized to Sir Thomas of Yagababar for the interruption. Would he like more tea, she asked, or again something stronger? Thomas nodded with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes as he watched the woman leave him for something clearly far more important than a large sack of gold. Hell's bells, thought Thomas, who had just started to crack the surface. Outside, Zirath's gaze snapped toward a sudden thump. A man on the far side of the square had collapsed, flat on his back, unmoving, no wound, no cry, and no sign of what had struck him, or how he's tripped. He scanned and saw nothing. He cursed himself for reading the tea leaves and seeing ghosts. Inside the white marble hall, the three adventurers in the bank lobby and lines were seeing the same thing. For all Celia and Zora knew, the risk was now that Thomas might get locked in that small room for goodness knows how long. Zora shifted. Celia's gaze narrowed. They whispered about making a play. Grab the door. Cause a distraction. Anything. Frizz, seeing the same thing unfold, acted first. One hand slipped to her pocket. The sending stone hummed. The message was short and quiet to Thomas. Her message to everyone was short. Get ready. The wizard had made up her mind. She was about to roll the dice on a risky gambit. Outside, Zirath's hand moved to his axe. Around the other muscle, Celia moved her weight to her back foot. Zora reached in and touched the edge of wild magic, eyes focused on any possible trouble from the other hired muscle. In the small chamber, Thomas went still, quite pale, and wondered what the hells did that mean. Back in the long, slow line, Frizz turned again, her fingers twitching. The spell whispered into being. Detect thoughts. She brushed the bank manager's surface mind as she walked to her office with the two Central City bankers. Delayed balance shipments, low reserves, regional banks impatient. The thoughts were rushed, filled with anxiety. She had struck a proverbial nerve. For the second time, she rolled the dice as she cut deeper into her target's mind. And that was the mistake. The walls screamed. Magic lit like oil across etched symbols, sigils flared on walls, and alarms roared, doors slammed, a dozen voices barked orders at once. Iron grates fell from ceilings, wards flared blue. A spell had been seen. Frizz turned on her heel. Her exit was quick, deliberate, moving with the flow of panicked people. Inside the chamber, Thomas bolted. He hit the hallway just before the vault door began to seal again. A narrow escape from becoming part of the furniture. Zora was already moving. Celia saw an opening. In the chaos, she bumped into the bank manager and pulled her keys with some careful sleight of hand. She turned to the hired muscle, but all were collecting their patrons and protecting them as they headed for the door. Tellers shouted that everything was fine, that calm must be maintained, that guests should remain in place. But behind those words, doors locked. The bank began to close. Outside, Zirath spotted something worrisome. In a perfect line, 3 automatons, the same that guarded the Velvet Fang, were rushing to the bank. Where had they come from, he wondered, as his hand moved to his axe. But, as the bankers had, they rushed right past him and moved toward Harken's main doors. Zirath focused his attention on looking for an escape route, magical alarms blaring, and arcane bars manifesting over windows and doors of the bank. Things were nearly locked down as just in the nick of time all 4 adventurers dashed past the exit, found Zirath, who waved them down an alley and around a corner, past crates, carts and silent shutters, breath ragged, boots pounding. They didn't stop until the bells fell silent and their breath burned in their chests. Harken had shown its teeth, and the gold behind those doors wasn't the only thing guarded. The alley was quiet now, save for the sound of breath catching in tired lungs and the occasional shuffle of a boot against cobblestone. The scent of stone dust and city oil still clung to their clothes, but the adrenaline had finally begun to ebb. They ducked behind crates and old cloth awnings, out of view but close enough to whisper. Thomas was the first to speak, still brushing the dust off his coat with irritated flicks. He'd seen enough. Harken didn't care where the coin came from. Gold was gold. No questions asked, no provenance required. He laid out the obvious with the kind of smug satisfaction only earned by surviving a room full of sigils and snake smiles. Flint, he confirmed, was a client, not just a name on a ledger. The man had helped fund the Darkwood Road project. Whether that meant control or complicity wasn't yet clear, but the pieces were beginning to fit together. Friz, still adjusting her glasses and glancing over her shoulder more than usual, admitted her part. She walked them through the layers of protection she'd felt, abjuration defences built into the bones of the bank, the echo of arcane traps likely buried in the vaults and the quiet pressure of divination magic keeping constant watch. She offered an apology that was more irritated than ashamed. She had triggered the alarm, yes, but not without a reason. She had pushed deeper into the bank manager's thoughts and found a thread worth pulling. That thread was gold, or rather, the lack of it. The regional Harken branches were running light. Central City was late on their shipments. The reserves were thin, and the manager had been trying to keep the edges of her panic folded neatly behind protocol. That panic had been real. It had weight. The bank wasn't just operating, it was teetering. Zora offered a low whistle at that. Thomas raised a brow, and then Celia cleared her throat. She produced the object with the ease of someone showing a trinket picked up at market, a ring of fine, delicate keys. She'd lifted them during the scramble, right before the manager ran off to meet the central bankers. No magic, no alarms, just fast fingers and quiet timing. She didn't know what locks they'd open, not yet. But they'd kept worse in their pockets before. Zirath, still standing watch at the alley mouth, shared what he'd seen. No guards had followed the bankers. Zora nodded, having clocked the same. But Zirath had seen more. Gold and silver guardians, like the ones that stood sentinel in the hotel's stairwells, were now en route to the bank. Those automatons were popping up in all sorts of places, said Zirath, wondering just who or what was animating them. Something with long reach was behind all of this, and with that in mind, they started planning their next steps. Christoph Atler Le Baron, the retired rancher they'd crossed paths with in Brigaton, and 3 days prior, voice echoed in their thoughts, half pomp, half whisper. Thaddeus Flint was hosting a private dinner later tonight. No fanfare, no public invitations, and very private. Just a quiet gathering of influence behind tall doors. The who's who of Tanner Town would be there. They agreed. Whatever would be whispered in the shadows of Flint's compound would be worth its weight in gold. The second caper was on. They lingered beneath the fading light, the horizon bruised in shades of amber and rust, as the wind rolled over the dry grass, carrying with it the scent of livestock, and the faint metallic tang of stone, warmed by day and cooled by dusk. From the edge of town, beyond the last weather-beaten fence posts and silos, they could see it rising, Flint's compound, less a home and more a private dominion of fences, fields, and old power, carved neatly into the plains. The walls were high, quarried stone transported at great expense, a fact Thomas muttered about with a sardonic smile. And while the walls weren't just for show, the guards who patrolled them were lean, precise, and seasoned, their movements measured in slow, steady arcs. High above, Thomas's owl circled wide and silent, its eyes catching flashes of steel, the muted torchlight of the patrols, and the restless movement of mastiffs pacing the manor grounds in organised, overlapping patterns that were anything but random. It wasn't just the walls that protected Flint's estate, it was the living, breathing system within them. Guards watched the gates, but the dogs, sharp and trained, watched everything else, crossing the terrain in diagonal patterns and sniffing the air with a persistence that invisibility spells couldn't fool. When Celia, sharp-eyed and practical as ever, asked Zora if he had any food on him, the barbarian let out a low sigh, dug into his pack with reluctant resignation, and produced a single, crumpled stick of jerky that he stared at for a long moment before eating it with a grimace, and a muttered comment about tasting that much better for the dogs. They regretted not for the last time that they hadn't pressed the old cattle baron for more details, since the man had once owned the very estate they were now trying to infiltrate, before Flint had taken it, bought it, or forced it from him. The details weren't quite clear. But timing was their ally for once, as the first guests for Flint's private dinner began to arrive, riding up the stone road in pairs and groups, clad in tailored leathers, with gild pins polished and ceremonial sashes folded just so. These were the leaders of Tanner Town's industries, ranchers, tanners, and textile barons, all bound to Flint by contracts, debt, or worse. And while the guards greeted them with forced cheer, the noise of horses and clinking tack gave the adventurers the moment they needed. The open ground between the city and the estate offered no cover, just an exposed, crushed stone road. They knew any alarm would cut their retreat to ribbons, so the plan became one of timing, discipline, and silence. They would use their magic, hard-earned items and prepared spells to vanish from sight, but the enchantments would require restraint. No attacks, no casting beyond the initial spell, and no noise that might draw attention to themselves, which led to Zirath flatly refusing to remove his armour, adding with finality that if anyone wanted it off, they'd have to come and retrieve it. Their spell would last an hour, and in the waning light of the evening the countdown began. Ropes were tossed, hooks latched into stone, and one by one they ascended and dropped silently into the long, wild grasses within the compound, immediately casting their spells as the last heel touched down, vanishing from the world as the dinner gate swung wide to receive their guests. They moved swiftly, darting across lawn and brush, their cloaks flaring behind them in silent gusts, and the owl wheeled back to Thomas with a warning. The dogs were near. The faintest shuffle of claws on gravel followed, accompanied by a low, rolling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and while they couldn't be seen, they could be scented. So Celia sprinted ahead, her motion near invisible but her instincts guiding her, warning the others of guard paths and dog patrols. Still, one of the mastiffs stopped mid-step, ears raised, and began sniffing hard toward their position, its posture stiffening. And in that breathless pause, Thomas sent the owl in low and fast. The bird dove with a shriek, fainted, darted between the trees, and within seconds the dogs gave chase, barking, surging away from the group in a blur of fur and fury, too distracted to follow the trail they'd nearly uncovered. No shouts, no alarm bells, no raised voices, and they waited just long enough to be sure, then ran. The remaining ground passed beneath their boots in a blur, and with time passing on their enchantments, they ducked behind hedges and tall stalks of ornamental grass, through the manicured garden paths and tilled soil of Flint's estate, the old manor looming ahead. And as they pressed into its shadow, no alarms or suspicions raised, a critical success. As the group pushed deeper into Flint's personal dominion, the texture of the estate changed. The pasture grass gave way to precisely cut lawn, and the dirt road underfoot became well-laid cobblestone, every stone squared and fitted, and noisy to step on. They passed an old windmill first, its silhouette jagged against the last traces of twilight, sails still slowly turning in the breeze. A squat stone base braced the wooden tower, and even the mill's aged frame had been scrubbed and reinforced. It wasn't just working, it was maintained. Just beyond it, a pair of stables spread wide. High ceilings, red-tiled roof, and wood, polished to a soft sheen. This wasn't a place to keep ornamental livestock. Two other buildings sat farther off. One, wide and squat, with smoke rising faintly from copper chimneys. The other, square and featureless, but built with the kind of stone usually reserved for garrisons. The owl wheeled once more overhead and returned with a whisper through Thomas's senses. Only one guard still patrolled the grounds. Just one. Either luck had held, or their earlier dance with the mastiffs hadn't been noticed. The group scattered to investigate. Zora moved first, peeling off toward the windmill. The creaking gears masked his steps, and when he tested a nearby window, it gave with a soft groan. No lock, no trap, just old hinges and a streak of good fortune. He climbed in, boots landing silently on worn wooden boards. The wide interior was alive with movement. The gears turned above, connected to a long rod that disappeared down into a stone well. He watched it for a moment and then turned toward the water pumping into barrels, and a wide stone-cut cistern. He focused for a moment, and the edge of the cistern wasn't a stone-cut slab at all. It was a staircase hidden beneath the churning surface. Back outside, Celia darted toward the stone warehouse on the far side of the compound. She timed her sprint between the guards' passes with surgical precision, ducking low and silent to the side of the building he had just walked past. She pressed herself against the wall and peered inside. Ranch equipment among wooden crates. The door to the side was fortunately unlocked. Inside it was dim and still. Nothing seemed out of place, until her ears caught the faintest of footsteps, soft and careful. Someone else was in there with Celia, and they weren't walking. They were creeping. Celia found her center, stopped breathing, and scanned her surroundings. Back outside, Thomas had veered off from the others, drawn by the stables and the voices his owl had reported earlier. He didn't like leaving the group, but he wanted faces. He wanted purpose. The stables were the furthest building from the windmill, but they were closest to Flint's money. He crept across the cobblestone, and each quiet step brought the voices closer, two of them, maybe three, murmuring low, indistinct, and just out of reach. A few more steps, and he might hear what they were saying. On his side of the manor's terraces, Zirath, heavy with armor, managed to be very quiet for his size. He moved to the squat building with smoke trailing faintly from the roof. A meat processing hall, he quickly noted. A smokehouse doubling as an abattoir. Rows of salted beef hung from hooks. The air was thick with brine and age. It was exactly the kind of place Zora would hate. No doubt the barbarian would have left behind muddy footprints and bite marks. Zirath, however, moved carefully, noting the faint grooves in the floor where blood was channeled into old drains. He followed them with narrowed eyes, watched them vanish beneath a grated iron vent. But the grate was too wide. To Zirath's sharp eyes, it wasn't for drainage at all. Someone could walk upright through that passage. It was a tunnel, and it must have had an entrance somewhere, thought the paladin. Back in the courtyard, Friz trying to cross to Zirath's location when the smallest of things nearly disrupted their whole plan. She clipped an insignificant pebble, and it skipped, rolled and tapped against the base of a planter with a sound that cracked through the silence like a slap. The guard, lean and angular, turned immediately. He held up his torch and scanned the shadows. Friz froze mid-step, knees bent, breath caged in her chest. He stepped forward, another step. He raised the torch higher. Thomas, then heading toward the stables, sensed the tension through the owl and acted fast. He sent the familiar darting through the branches overhead, wings flaring, screeching just enough to cause a stir. The guard blinked, muttered a curse, and turned to follow the sound, eyes narrowing but posture easing. After a pause, he moved on. Friz didn't move, not for another 5 seconds. That had been too close. Thomas turned back from the stables. Whatever secrets were waiting there could wait a little longer. Back inside the warehouse, Celia stilled herself completely. Whoever was sharing the room with her was as silent as she was, which meant they were trained. She saw no one in there with her. And the terrible thought or someone else invisible in there made her look for dust or dirt or something old and brittle, something to throw to reveal the unseen. She edged toward a corner where older crates had gathered cobwebs and thinner layers of dust, and there in the low light she saw it. Footsteps. Fresh. They hadn't just been there. They were still there now. She froze. So did the air around her. Meanwhile, back at the windmill, Zora stared at the gears and cursed softly under his breath. None of it made sense to him, but something in his gut said the water had to stop. He grabbed a lever at random, one of 3, and pulled. The gears above groaned. The sails creaked, but didn't stop. And slowly, the water receded. Well, thought Zora, that was lucky. A square of stone beneath the water shimmered. A seam became a door, and when the last of the water drained, the hidden staircase stood revealed. Zora reached for the sending stone. Windmill, now hidden door, going underground. The message echoed through each of their minds like a quiet alarm. Zirath moved immediately, slipping back through the smokehouse, already calculating how much backup they'd need. He and Thomas dashed to the mill without a sound, sign, or moved blade of grass. From their respective positions, Friz and Thomas turned in tandem and began making their way across the path until they stopped dead at the sound of approaching hooves. 2 horses trotted into view across the cobblestone path, their riders relaxed but well-dressed. One of them, older, precise, draped in understated silk, wore a silver pin in the shape of a triple-towered coin. The chief comptroller of Harken Bank. He was not alone. Another rode beside him, speaking in low tones, their pace calm, their posture unbothered. They passed within feet of the unseen adventurers, the conversation faint but familiar. They were guests and speaking in hushed tones as the guard was heading toward them. Friz made a choice. She stopped on her way to the mill and listened in, nearly close enough to touch, to overhear the whispering. The younger banker, sitting on a beautifully saddled horse, was surprised at their late invitation. The chief comptroller, for his part, fully expected Mr. Flint to speak about his considerable investment in the Darkwood. He reminded, rather firmly, that he would be doing all the talking. The younger banker deflated, pipped up. The 2 hushed on the matter when the guard approached and said he'd guide them in. Friz waited for them to step away, then quietly and slowly made her way to the mill, this time moving between the cursed stones and pebbles. They regrouped at the base of the windmill, slipping into the open door one by one, closing it carefully behind them. Inside, the only light came the torchlight that illuminated the cobblestone walkway to the Skinner's manor. They waited in silence, watching from the narrow window above the cistern, counting the seconds until the guards and bankers had vanished into the depths of Flint's manor. When the last hoofbeat faded, they allowed breath to return. Celia was the first to break the quiet, her voice flat but edged with unease. She asked if any of them had been inside the warehouse. Not near it, but with her inside it. The confused responses of no that followed were answer enough, and the tension that had begun to ease curled tight again, winding itself back into their shoulders. Someone else had been there, someone unseen. The possibilities bloomed and none of them were good. Friz's brows furrowed as she mentally reviewed every spell she hadn't used that might have revealed a hidden presence, while Thomas turned back toward the outer door just to be sure it hadn't creaked open in the last few minutes. It hadn't. The windows were shut, no footprints in the dust but Celia's. The other tracks, the ones she'd seen, had simply stopped. Resigned and with a mission in mind, they headed down the cold stone steps. The steps led into cold stone, slick with old moisture and smelling of rust and churned dirt. At the bottom a door waited, or rather resisted. Rusted iron, swollen with age, wedged into place and unopened for a very long time. Zora stepped forward without hesitation, put both hands to the frame, and thought this was finally a job for a barbarian. He heaved upward against the weight and rust. The unfortunate silence that followed wasn't awkward, not yet, but it was long. Then Zirath's voice floated down from behind them, soft, sonorous, and knowing. He asked if Zora needed a hand. It was the kind of comment that might have passed unnoticed from anyone else, but coming from the paladin, it landed with the grace of a hammer wrapped in silk. Friz, bless her pure heart, took it earnestly. She offered to help, already halfway down the steps, before Zora could stop her. She began counting aloud, something she did to prepare a minor force spell, or perhaps to brace for strain. 1, 2. She didn't get to 3. Zora, invisible but palpably stung by Zirath's offer, let out a grunt, clenched his jaw, and mustered just enough power and pride to rip the door loose from its moorings with such force that Friz lifted with the door before landing on her feet, attested by the soft thud in the room. She blinked, thoroughly impressed and completely unaware of the emotional calculus that had just powered her victory. She declared the result perfect and beamed with satisfaction. Thomas and Celia did their honest best not to laugh at the spectacle of ego unfolding, completely unbeknownst to Friz. Celia, for her part, mused to herself that Zirath might simply know how to motivate his barbarian companion, and if that came at the expense of a little of his dignity, well, so be it. Zora didn't say anything, but his heavy footsteps were loud enough to be heard, even through the invisibility, and somehow they sounded both wounded and satisfied. With the rusted door behind them, they descended into the dark. Thick dust clung to the stone, and the scent of musty earth lingered in every breath, rich with minerals, old air, and something faintly metallic. Cobwebs drifted across their path like forgotten curtains, and the deeper they walked, the clearer it became that these tunnels hadn't seen traffic in a long while. Either the Skinner didn't know about them, or he didn't see the need to use them. In either case, that suited the party just fine. Invisible, they formed a line hand to shoulder and whispered messages back and forth. Thomas whispered that he'd go ahead and the rest held. His voice barely carried, but off he went, eyes low, fingers trailing the edges of the wall. He found what he expected, a tripwire, taut and easy to miss in the dim light, and disabled it with a flick of the wrist. They took their positions and continued. The passage opened forward, or turned right. They chose right and moved ahead, eyes scanning. Friz, her mind busy with angles and the turning passages, noted that they weren't just tunnels, they were connective. The way they turned, their distances, they likely linked the buildings above, the windmill, the warehouse, the abattoir, even the manor. They agreed with her assessment and made note of the direction toward Flint's manse. The barbarian offered to take the lead this time. His footsteps were heavier now that they weren't on open ground, but then everyone stopped at once. A sharp click echoed through the corridor. Zora, invisible and slightly too confident, had stepped on something and a blade snapped down from above. It was a crude mechanism, wooden bracing, iron edge, designed more for utility than elegance, but it swung with speed and purpose and caught Zora square across the shoulder. He managed to stifle a grunt and didn't fall. To the others it was stranger still. A swinging blade halted mid-air with a clang, seemingly striking nothing at all. Invisibility did have its advantages, chief among them avoiding the embarrassment that came with walking face-first into traps. They took it as a sign. The manor was the priority. Whatever else these tunnels connected, their risk outweighed their value. Thomas moved more carefully now, and Friz kept a close eye on the floors and corners. The path grew cleaner as they pressed on, less dust, fewer cobwebs, until it opened into a spiral stair carved directly into the earth, narrow and downward sloped, leading to a mechanical door set into the ceiling. It was clever engineering. An iron arm sat beside the stairs, bolted into stone, clearly designed to raise the door above. The metal showed signs of care, greased recently, perhaps even tested. Zarath stepped forward and asked everyone to step back, pulling something from his satchel. The eyes of Horus, gifts from the newly re-eyed librarian in the tomb of Syrinx, were no parlour trick. A relic of old magic, they proved to work exactly as the master tomekeeper had promised. Over them, through thick stone floors, a magical window appeared to all. A room was revealed. Not just any room, but a sunroom in style. Wide windows, pale tile, and a statue of some long-forgotten ranch deity standing sentry in the middle. But it was the two men that held their attention. Two ranchers. Well-dressed, too clean for fieldwork. Alone. Talking. Close. Too close. The way they leaned toward each other, the angle of their shoulders. It wasn't casual conversation. They spoke in whispers meant not to travel, not even to the walls. Thomas and Frizz tried to read their lips, but it was useless. They spoke too close, too quickly, too deliberately. Whatever this was, it wasn't part of the official dinner. After a moment, the two glanced to the door, clearly checking for listeners, and left. They shut the door behind them, careful, precise, and telling. They didn't want it known they'd been in that room. Frizz moved to the lever. It gave under steady pressure, and with a soft thunk, the statue above shifted. Not scraped. Moved. Silent as falling snow. Indeed, the gears and mechanisms were a well-maintained fast exit, or secret entrance. One by one they climbed up, silent as breath, invisible and alert. And with the statue sliding closed behind them, they entered the manor from below, unseen, unheard, and utterly uninvited. To Thomas, the break-in had gone surprisingly smooth, which meant they were all thoroughly on edge. Zora, who'd wounded his pride on a door and shoulder on an axe, felt differently about it, but said nothing. Now, after a near brush with a kitchen maid humming something suspiciously catchy, the party had crammed themselves into what could generously be described as a water closet. The privy was finely adorned like the rest of the manor. However, for the 5 heroes, it was also narrow, tight, and unfortunately aromatic. Thomas stood pressed between an antique vase and Zirath's armoured thigh, while Frizz tried in vain to avoid the polished cupboard handle that kept jabbing her in the ribs. Zora had somehow wedged himself above the small window like an irritated cat. Celia, ever graceful, remained perched on the lid of the closed commode, with the discipline of a trained monk, her arms folded and her expression blank. And then Thomas noticed the painting. It hung slightly crooked on the wall above the privy's tiny wash basin. An uninspired pastoral scene of cattle grazing in a sun-drenched meadow. It practically screamed aristocrat trying to seem salt of the earth. He gave it a nudge, it clicked and swung forth, and he blinked, turned to the group grinning as he revealed what was behind it. 2 tiny eye holes, rimmed in dust. Of course, he whispered, even though no one could see him, the profusely rich were profoundly predictable when it came to their spy holes. Thomas peered through the openings. The view was limited, but clear enough. A long dining table, gilded dishes, flickering candlelight, and at the head, an empty chair. The host hadn't arrived. However, several faces were familiar. Bank officials, textile barons. Some guests were still sitting. The house was alive with secrets. That much was certain now. Whether Flint knew about this little vantage point or not, someone had once used it. The hidden tunnels, the concealed eye holes, the careful construction of power. This estate had been built for more than cattle. This was a house for listening, and now Thomas was doing just that. As the invisible warlock leaned in, the voices from the next room grew clearer. Talk of the province, of border movements, of coin-changing hands and debts coming due. The kind of dinner where the main course wasn't the roast, it was someone's future. The rest made their plan quickly and in whispers. One by one, the others slipped out, leaving Thomas prepared to digest every bite of Thaddeus Flint's meal. Zora and Frizz would take the upper floor, Zora for muscle, Frizz for magic, and scout out any personal quarters or hidden studies Flint might keep behind false walls or beneath ornate rugs. Zirath and Celia would remain on the ground level, poking into drawing rooms, side chambers, and more crucially shadowing the servants. Most of the staff were already corralled into the kitchen. Murmured voices and the occasional clang of silverware echoing faintly from the far wing. Someone had announced that all were sitting for dinner, which meant that for now, the rooms were theirs. They paused at the door, listening for footsteps. The hallway beyond was quiet. One by one they exited, each placing a hand gently on the shoulder of the one ahead, navigating through the dark, working in tandem. Every step was deliberate, every brush of cloth against wall calculated. The invisibility made them hard to see, but it didn't silence the world around them. A tripped corner of a rug or a toppled vase would end this caper before it began. Zirath and Celia veered off toward the front parlour, following the sound of voices past, while Zora and Frizz took to the grand staircase, one wide and shallow step at a time, careful not to cause the wooden floors to creak. From the shadowed eyeholes of the privy wall, Thomas watched the performance begin. Guildmasters with rough hands and expensive rings, ranchers with tailored coats dyed in oxblood and saddle tan, tanners with yellowed fingernails and wine-stained teeth, men and women who shaped Tannertown not through vote but through volume of cattle, coin and control. Thomas noted the faces as they settled into small conversation. The pair from the sunroom were both here, seated far from one another, eyes carefully avoiding contact. They laughed at different jokes, nodded at different moments. It was, to Thomas, a louder silence than if they'd shouted across the room. That wasn't chance. That was strategy. But despite the clink of glasses and the surface politeness, the entire table leaned, ever so slightly, toward the empty chair at its head. Nothing would start until he arrived. Then the door opened and every voice at the table fell away. Thaddeus Flint was older than some of the guests, lean where others had grown soft, with a posture that held no arrogance, only calculation. His coat was long, dark crimson leather, worn at the edges but clearly maintained. Across his chest were scabbards, short, curved, hidden, wicked, daggers of all makes and origins, gleaming faintly with the polish of regular use. He spoke while looking straight ahead and coldly apologized for keeping them waiting, as he had some business in the stables. Thomas cursed himself for not following the voices, but let it go and focused. He didn't look at them as he approached, he didn't need to. Eyes followed him. He sat without ceremony, adjusted his sleeves, and offered a quiet, courteous thanks for their presence. No smile, no warmth, just acknowledgement. Like a blade tipping its edge in greeting. On his forearm. As he adjusted his cuff, it caught the light. The brand. A black bull's skull burned into the flesh, the mark of the phantom, charred and unmistakable. Before any thought could finish forming, the doors to the hall slammed open again, this time with speed. Servants rushed in, arms full of silver trays piled high with roast greens, spiced roots and crusted breads. They moved with the efficiency of ritual, each motion practiced, each step rehearsed, as though the entire evening had been choreographed long before any guest had arrived. Flint raised a single hand, and with a voice smoother than it had any right to be, he said the only words anyone would remember from the meal. "Let's begin." While the dining hall murmured back to life under the watchful silence of Thaddeus Flint, Zirath and Celia moved as shadows down a long, candlelit corridor along the manor's eastern wing. They moved in tandem, each sensing the other's pace with instinct honed from battle and infiltration alike. And just as they reached the door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, light spilling from the crack, a sudden noise fractured the stillness. A side door to their right slammed open with a thundering clack, and a servant burst through it, arms full of cloth and plates, too hurried to see anything in his path. Instinct took over. In a showcase of silent dexterity, Celia flattened herself against a carved cabinet in one smooth motion, while Zirath spun back into a recess of the wall, best he could, considering his size and breastplate. The servant rushed past between them, muttering something under his breath about bread and timing, utterly unaware of the two invisible figures that had just barely avoided collision. When the sound of his footsteps vanished around the corner, they moved again, swiftly, silently, into the cracked door. The room beyond was dim, save for the flicker of a fire smouldering low in a wrought-iron hearth. Shadows danced across walls, covered not in paintings or maps, but heads. The impressive trophy room was an assortment of mounted cattle heads and ivory, massive aurochs with curling horns, the snarling visages of displacer beasts and curved moor razor hogs, even the unmistakable skull of a plains drake, its teeth still stained with whatever blood it had once spilled. Other, less traditional items caught their attention. Glass display boxes lined the room, daggers of all shapes, some ceremonial, others rusted from use. Coiled lariats, stiff with age. Brands of iron from ranching families scattered across the plains. Spurs, badges, bits of cloth and belt. Small things, but they told a story. Each item was a debt paid in steel, a story of someone who had fought, failed, and been folded into Flint's domain. Ranches swallowed, guilds subdued, enemies archived. These weren't trophies of beasts. They were trophies of power. Zirath had seen such rooms of conquest before, and he thought of his homeland. The carpets at the top of the staircase were thick, muffling each footfall, and the long hallway stretched in both directions. They chose the left. Friz and Zora reached the landing just in time to catch movement below, a servant, arms full of trays, rushing down the corridor they'd just come from. He darted past a side hall, leading to where Celia and Zirath had gone. That confirmed it. The kitchen staff were still focused on the dining service, and no alarms had been raised. Friz whispered something to Zora. She knew the scent of old paper and wax. She found it within seconds. The library. It opened wide and dark, a study chamber once meant for scholars or bored aristocrats with aspirations toward intellect. The bookshelves stood floor to ceiling, carved from dark wood oak, and lined with volumes of every age and condition, most undisturbed for decades. Dust covered the everything. The coast was clear, but it was painfully obvious to Friz that this room didn't see much use, not even by the servants. They fanned out. Zora, taking up position near the doorway, kept watch. His eyes roamed across the room, but it was Friz who truly searched. She moved with the curiosity of someone who saw libraries not as rooms, but as puzzles. Thomas may have been sure of the spy holes in the paintings, but Friz knew libraries were just as rich a hiding place as any, tracing a finger over every bookend and bobble on the mantels. One at the bottom shelf at the end offered resistance. She leaned closer, smiled, gripped the edge of the carved bookend, and gave it a soft tug. It opened with a faint click. Behind it, a long cylindrical scroll case, carefully sealed and cradled within the hollowed shelf. Friz unscrewed the cap and unfurled the parchment slowly, reverently. Someone from long ago had treasured this, but the dirt and grime told a story of forget. It was a map, old gnomish script along the edges, the paper itself lined with tiny gears and faintly etched calibrations. The lines depicted terrain not as it was, but as it had once been, before settlements, before roads. Dotted across the map were tiny icons, unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. Strongholds, tinker-built. Hidden beneath the plains, north to south from the mountains, ruins now long forgotten. Zora leaned in to look and let out a low breath. It hadn't been touched in years, likely kept here by some former owner long before Flint bought the walls and renamed the halls. And whoever once owned it was probably dust by now. Friz rolled it carefully and slipped it into her satchel. She'd take it to the tinker. They pressed on. The library had given them more than they'd expected, but the manor had more rooms still, and not every treasure was tucked behind paper. Luckily, the floors didn't creak. Back in the hidden nook of the privy, Thomas remained still. Every scrape of cutlery, every clink of glass, every shallow breath taken around that long table. He registered it all with the honed focus of a man who'd spent half his life listening for what wasn't said. The dinner had turned quiet, not silent but measured, a kind of conversational dance where every phrase was bait and every compliment wore the weight of a threat. To the untrained ear, it might have sounded like small talk. The weather on the coast, the price of oxhide, a toast to the long peace between the east and the plains. But Thomas knew better. Everything was double talk. Seated among those under Flint's control were 3 strangers. 2 were bankers, both wearing the quiet authority of Central City, Sharp coats, simple brooches, not a single wasted motion between them. But the third man drew Thomas's attention as he was the proverbial odd man out. Linen clothes, pale blues and cream, the kind that didn't belong anywhere near a ranch. His cuffs bore decorative knots, mariner's work, Thomas guessed. The lines on his hands, the salt-weathered skin at his neck, the posture of someone used to ordering men who don't ask questions. A captain, or perhaps a commodore, and his best guess from the darker clothing was Westport. He listened closer as the topic began to drift, east meeting west, supply lines stretching longer than they used to, the difficulty of getting grain shipments past the Badlands. A few ranchers offered idle platitudes about distance and delays, but it was clear none of this mattered. It was leading up to something. And then Thaddeus Flint finally leaned forward, just slightly, just enough, and asked the mariner about the fleet. There it was. Flint was speaking to the mariner, but looking at the bankers. Thomas's heart ticked up a beat. He didn't move. The old seafarer, a man whose name hadn't even been offered, which in itself said plenty, shifted. Just enough to show discomfort. He replied with grace but unease, his hands moving just a bit more than his words required. He mentioned old families, legacy wealth, ancient trade routes, the East dragging its coffers westward by ship and spine. And then something stranger as he mentioned the ships carrying something big, dragging it from the coast. The magnate seemed confused. He stammered slightly, clarified that he didn't know specifics, that it was likely cargo of strategic value, that he was told little beyond volume. The words were offered like a shield, but shields only worked when someone wasn't trying to pry underneath. The chief comptroller drew Thomas's eye. He hadn't spoken. Not a single word. He just watched Thaddeus with a cool, controlled gaze. Too cool by half. Like a man waiting for a blade to be drawn. The magnate tried to steer the conversation back to safe shores. Praise for the meal, a laugh about the strength of Tannertown whiskey, and Thaddeus, after a long pause, relented with a nod and a faint smile. The pressure eased. The mariner exhaled, and Thaddeus called for his better corn whiskey to be served to the guest. The others followed suit, eating once more, glasses raised. Knives and skewers returned to plates. Thomas didn't understand why Flint wanted to know about the fleet, why someone who ruled the plains would care what sailed in from the coast. But he knew one thing now for certain. Flint wanted Harken Bank to know that he was asking. Back in the trophy, the fire in the hearth flickered low, casting light across rows of glass displays and mounted kills that marked Flint's long and ruthless rise. Celia and Zirath moved with care, weaving between the cases in tandem. The blades caught Zirath's eye first, finely balanced, beautifully honed, but nothing exceptional. No more elegant than what he'd handled in Dagger Dax's shop back in the city. Brutal, yes, polished certainly, but unremarkable, all things considered. Then they saw it. At the end of the room, lit by a quiet pool of candlelight and balanced delicately on bronzed bullhorns, was a simple steel rod. At first glance, it could have passed for a tool, plain, unimpressive, but something about the way it had been placed, front and centre, without label or plaque, marked it as important. Its only ornament was a small mechanism at one end, a button recessed into the steel. Celia leaned closer, and an old story came back to her. A lesson half-remembered from her earliest training. A tale of a monk who could walk and swing across thin air, step by step, defying gravity and terrain, with nothing but a rod held firm in place as though gripped by the gods themselves. She whispered to Zirath, an immovable rod, rare, powerful, the kind of magic that didn't just change battles, it changed plans. Zirath, still watching the thing, nodded slowly. It made sense, he said. For a man who tamed the plains, broke ranches beneath him and drove wild herds across the province, this was the ideal tool. Not a weapon of killing. A weapon of control. A rod that could stop a charging auroch mid-sprint. The perfect item for the most audacious rancher. They both stared at the glass. They whispered that it looked unguarded, which of course meant nothing. They pored over it, and there were no visible runes, no sigils glowing faintly beneath the wood, just the glass, the horns, and the steel. They whispered, came to agreement without much ceremony, and slowly, very slowly, lifted the case. The risk, they agreed, was worth the reward. And suddenly, nothing. No sparks flew, no alarms rang, there was no sudden surge of magical resistance. Celia reached for the rod, hand steady, and still nothing. Her fingers closed around cool steel. It lifted cleanly, soundlessly, resting perfectly in her grip. It was heavier than it looked, dense with quiet power. Then Zirath let out a quiet exhale, whispered that Thaddeus Flint, it seemed, truly believed himself untouchable within these walls. And because of that, the party now possessed an artifact that could hold a door shut against a dragon, or pin a cart mid-plunge over a canyon. They slipped out of the trophy room as quietly as they had entered. One more victory tucked under cloak and silence. Around a corner, Celia and Zirath froze as they saw a familiar face striding right toward them. Back in the privy, the rough wood was pressing uncomfortably against Thomas's brow. The smell in the tiny room had long since faded into irrelevance. What mattered now was every gesture, every word from the table beyond. No one had left for the lavatory. The wine was flowing freely, and yet the privy sat unvisited. That, in itself, was beginning to make Thomas sweat. One step, one nudge, one past its prime bladder, and this paper-thin plan may well crumble like week-old shortbread. The conversation had turned dry. Baronial updates, matters of field and forge, progress reports on mills, tanneries, and labour drafts. A rancher muttered something sardonic about the Darkwood Road being paved in gold given its cost. Laughter followed. Flint did not join in. Instead, his chair creaked subtly as he turned his attention to the younger of the two bankers. He asked, pointedly, smoothly, whether the lad rode. The young man lit up with the enthusiasm only the young and wealthy could manage, and spoke of riding through the southern hill lands, of his stables in Gildcrest west of Inkwell, and the mare his father had gifted him when he came of age. He finally seemed in his element. Flint nodded, slow and deliberate, and shared a tale of his own silver mare, wild-born, untamed, a streak of moonlight and fury he had wrangled himself from the plains. Fastest beast in 3 provinces, he claimed, a hunter's mount. The banker, charmed and dumbstruck, could only nod, and when Flint offered, casually, that he may see the mare, and even take her out for a ride, the invitation twisted into something else entirely. There was a moment, a flicker, an awkward hesitation from the banker, who hadn't expected now. But Thaddeus Flint stood and the matter was settled. A rancher already on his feet offered to escort the lad and warned, with a too casual tone, that the compound was large, the hour was late, and the dogs were eager for meat. It was not a threat, not explicitly. But even through a wooden wall, Thomas felt the chill in those words. As the banker stepped out, half embarrassed and clinging to propriety, he cast a glance at the comptroller. The older man met his gaze, unreadable. And then a small nod. Permission given, though, for what, Thomas couldn't say. The door closed behind them. Silence followed. Flint, sitting now, didn't look at his food. He didn't look at his wine. He looked at the chair that had just been vacated, and then, with slow clarity, turned his gaze on the comptroller. The scraping of sharpened silver on ceramic resumed, faint and methodical. Flint's voice cut through the murmurs, soft and curious, and said that he had some questions about his money. Upstairs, Zora and Friz moved steadily, their steps cushioned by the thick red carpet that ran the centre length of the corridor. No footsteps echoed, no voices drifted. The upper floor was theirs. If someone came, they'd have to risk the hardwood. So far, so good. The doors were many, and without knowing which led where, they chose the third. An old instinct, perhaps, or simply luck. It opened without resistance unto a Spartan private study. Sparse walls, unlit fireplace. But the logs were fresh, dry and placed with care. No dust on the mantel, no cobwebs on the beams. This room was used. Often. Friz mouthed that she'd take the desk, and Zora, relieved to avoid another round of rifling through scrolls and ink, gave a thumbs up and turned toward the hallway. He planted himself near the door, arms crossed, listening for the sound of boots or trouble. Friz, meanwhile, crept to the desk like it might wake if disturbed too quickly. The floor didn't creak, the room didn't shift. The desk was old oak, but uncluttered. A well-used inkpot, a sharpened quill, a blotter recently pressed, and 2 small paintings. The first caught her breath, and a woman, not dressed in finery, not made up for portraiture. Simple dress, weather-kissed skin, hair a strange blend of strawberry and flame. Beside her, in a smaller frame, was a girl, green eyes wide, bearing the same structure in her face, the same tilt of her head. A child, but unmistakable. Dax. The same Dax who had vanished in the darkwood. Her mother, beside her. Quiet, private, kept not on the wall, but here. These were the only things Flint kept close. Friz blinked, then resumed her task. She moved through the drawers gently, brushing past pages of old letters and ink-smudged receipts, until her fingers tapped against a false seam. A drawer with a double back. She probed it, felt the give of the hidden catch, and slid it open. She recognized the type of book this was. Inside were Flint's ledgers, bound in black leather with pages pressed so tightly they might have grown from the same tree. But more concerning was the mechanism guarding them. A thin glass ampule cradled in a wrought frame above the book filled with a thick, acrid liquid. Salt and sulphur, viscous, ruinous. Attached to the ampule was a ticking codex, 5 rotating gears with inset runes and a pressure latch. The kind of trap you only got one chance to solve. And it was ticking. Friz swore silently. The timing was brutal. She could feel the gears accelerating, a slow-building urgency just beneath the wood. Across the room, Zora glanced back and saw something peculiar. A book rising into the air, floating as Friz worked. Typical, he thought, amused. Always unearthing some dusty spell book or cursed manual. Silly wizard things. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, smiling faintly. Back at the desk, Friz was sweating. The ticking had quickened, now racing like a heartbeat under duress. Her mind scrambled through options, words, names, numbers. Then her eyes darted back to the desk. Only 2 items had been given space in this room. Those paintings. She snatched the smaller frame, turning it over, searching. At the base, engraved faintly into the wood, was a single line. A Daxa, 7 years old. She spun the codex's gears with new purpose, ADAXA. With a final breath, she pressed the latch. Click. The ticking stopped, and critically the ampule stayed where it was. Unbroken. The ledgers, thankfully, were unharmed. The desk released its secrets. And at that exact moment, Zora leaned in and whispered with genuine concern if she needed any help. Downstairs, Thomas, still wedged in the privy's hidden perch, could feel tension over dinner climbing. The senior banker was alone now, seated among ranch lords and tanner barons. It was a hunt in formal wear, and started when Flint put down his knife and skewer. Flint, every move measured, began with an almost pleasant tone. He asked after the Harken Bank's commitments, specifically the Darkwood construction efforts and the bridge spanning the Great River. The words sounded like business. The tone sounded like a test. To the banker's credit, he didn't flinch. He launched into a well-rehearsed answer. Stone floated from mountain quarries had slowed, yes, but nothing unexpected. The logs and measurements all matched. The eastern foreman had suggested diverting workers north to increase pace. Logistics were challenging, of course, too many people, too few boats, but the project would continue as scheduled. Smooth. Efficient. All under control. Every word designed to sound like nothing was wrong. Thomas noted the subtlety. The way the banker crafted a bubble around his story. isolating it from the rest of the table. Too smooth. These weren't off-the-cuff remarks. These were practiced statements, legal in tone and sharpened in precision. Then came the next blade, wrapped in velvet. Flint leaned in slightly and asked about his own accounts. Investments. The funds he'd pledged for the road to the north. How were they holding? "And what of the rumour?" he asked, regarding delayed shipments of gold from Central to the regional Harken branches. That was the tell. Thomas stiffened. There it was again. That same thread Frizz had pulled from the mind of the bankhead financier earlier. Delays, gold, a tightening noose behind closed vaults. The banker didn't blink. He spoke of traffic, of surges in demand, of travellers from all provinces flooding the east for the co-sponsored tourney. He emphasised that word, co-sponsored, just enough to remind everyone that the Harken Bank was not acting alone. He praised the east for its vigour, mentioned that the gold was indeed en route, and reassured that all obligations would be met, as always. The man had been briefed, prepped and trained. The chief comptroller of Harken Bank was sitting in a room full of wolves, and he hadn't so much as scratched. Then, with the cool arrogance of a man who knew the game and played it well, the banker offered a small smile and remarked that Mr. Flint's reputation with a blade was legendary, that he no doubt would dominate the tourney both in the arena and in the eyes of the people. A pivot and a compliment. Very smooth, thought Thomas, as he watched closely. For a second, just a second, something flickered behind Flint's eyes, between irritation and amusement, a hunter recognizing the skill of another. The Skinner's fingers tightened on his glass. The banker raised his cup. A toast he offered to Mr. Flint's success. The room held its breath, and then Flint, finally, raised his own glass, expression unreadable but unmistakably cold, and returned the gesture. For now the duel was done, and now the flourish. Flint stood, and with the kind of controlled drama only a man certain of his power could summon, announced that he would spare no expense for his guests. As a token of his esteem, he had arranged a private performance, none other than the legendary bard himself, Amadeus von Halen. The crowd murmured with interest, the tension folding itself neatly beneath the promise of music and myth. He was due to arrive any moment, said Flint, and Thomas, still listening from the shadows, realized that whatever the endgame was, it was nearing. Upstairs, in the hush of Flint's study, Zora watched the impossible unfold with the calm awe of someone who had long ago accepted that wizards were simply built different. The book, large, leather-bound, was a hoard of information clearly only known to Flint. As the pages of Flint's ledgers flipped with supernatural speed, Frizz's eyes darted absorbed, passing rows of ink-stamped sums and hastily added annotations, no magic, just meticulous cruelty. The first thing she noticed was what wasn't there. No taxes. Not officially. Not state-mandated. These were extractions. Quiet withdrawals. Private levies pulled from tanner towns every seam. The elderly, the injured, the ranch-hardened families with more rope than coin. The children. Everyone was giving something. All of it went to two things. First, the visible. The projects. Windmills. Sawmills. Orchards carved from untamed land. They'd seen them on the approach. Flint built things. Second, something more sinister. For those who had no gold, hours had been tallied instead. Labour had become currency. Frizz saw work rosters with no pay. Entire families conscripted into labour debt. The third column that made her stomach lurch. The Darkwood Road. Long hauls of materials from the mountain spine down into the plains. The gravel, the stone, the staggeringly precise weight of each shipment and its obscene cost. Flint wasn't just involved. He was the fulcrum. The bank paid late, the province waited, but Flint had already paid up front. And then, just before the final pages, Frizz saw the cut that explained some of what they had learned so far. Thaddeus Flint wasn't keeping the gold. It was all redistributed, siphoned out to pay for the projects and then to other barons. Payments for loyalty, guaranteed by their fear, and and his power. The money moved in circles, and each gold coin returned with a promise. Friz pulled back slightly, lips parted in thought, pulse hammering in her ears, as she realized Flint was building a kingdom, insulated from the rest of the province. It was how calculated it all was, how clean, how sustainable. There was no madman here, just a man too patient for the rest of them to notice, building a vision on debts of blood, sweat, and gold. Zora saw near 80 pages and thousands of transactions turned and scanned in less than a minute. Friz had blinked once, nodded slightly, and then, with a kind of reverence, let the cover fall shut with barely a whisper. Everything was returned to its place. Every drawer, every loose page, every artifact, exactly as it had been. Zora had no idea what she'd seen, only that she'd seen a lot. Friz adjusted her glasses and stepped lightly away from the desk, her voice just above a whisper. She'd uncovered something, she said, something important, something about the flow of gold through the province, the arrangements behind the road contracts, and a recurring term they'd heard since arriving in the eastern reaches. The skinner's pound of flesh. She didn't elaborate, not yet, but her tone told Zora everything he needed to know. Whatever it meant, it was dark, it was deliberate, and it was old. And then a sharp pulse buzzed in their minds. The sending stones crackled faintly. Words, tight and clipped, spoken from below. Thomas's voice rang, urgent and focused. Flint was on the move. Downstairs. The hallways near the main foyer still glowed with firelight and the murmured energy of a well-fed, well-dressed storm brewing behind dinner smiles. Celia and Zirath turned a corner, only to come face to face with a walking crescendo. Amadeus von Halen. The bard strode forward, soft-stepping, crooning to himself in melodic breath about Reed's feed and seed, and its unfortunate transfer to his dim-wit brother Chuck. His hat sat rakishly off-centre, and his coat trailed with magical billowing. Celia reacted first. An arm shot out, found Zirath, and yanked them both into the nearest open door, just inches ahead of what would have been an invisible shoulder-to-shoulder collision with the colourful singer. The door clicked softly shut behind them as Von Halen paused. He stood just outside, head tilted, listening. For one breathless moment, nothing moved. Not Zirath. Not Celia. Not the dust. The bard tapped his chin, as though considering a counterpoint, then shrugged and continued on, the bawdy tune growing louder as he turned down another corridor, his voice lilting he-ceiling. Inside the room, Celia and Zirath slowly released the tension in their muscles, and for the first time, noticed where they were. The coat room. A long rack of cloaks, walking sticks, gilded satchels, and the carefully curated baggage of influence. Personal effects of the East's elite hung in quiet congregation. It took Zirath less than a moment to realize the opportunity. Celia was already moving. With deft fingers she slipped between coats and scarves. Her eyes scanned for names, crests, anything identifying. And then, there. The Chief Comptroller's coat, with the embroidered Harken sigil, had an inside pocket with a slim chain. On it, a ring of keys. One of them shimmered faintly with a runic shimmer, the unmistakable mark of arcane access they'd seen for the Velvet Suite access, finally, and possibly the Chief Comptroller's room. Then the stone buzzed. Thomas's voice, urgent and unmistakable, called them back underground. Right now. Whatever real show Flint had planned, it was about to start. Back in the cramped confines of the privy, Thomas's ear remained to the wall, eye fixed to the dust-caked peepholes. The final toasts were being raised now, formal, clipped, full of pleasantries that rang hollow beneath the polish of manners and the clink of crystal. The Skinner stood and called for dessert, brandy and music in the conservatory, as the bard's performance was to begin shortly, and all would be treated to his unmatched talents. He added offhandedly that he'd be joining them after the intermission. He had a bit of business to attend to. Thomas didn't like that, not one bit. It wasn't just the phrasing. It was the timing. He wanted to be alone, or at least away from everyone present. And judging by the glances exchanged across the table, by the subtle stiffening of shoulders and the way a few of Flint's own men stood just a fraction too quickly, Thomas wasn't the only one who noticed. Some of them looked surprised. Not all of them expected this. The guests rose one by one, filtering out through the double doors in proper formation. Bankers and ranchers and guildmasters heading toward the voice of Von Halen, warming up. But through the crack in the privy door, Thomas saw Flint leave last. He readied to message the others should he head their way. Thaddeus slipped through the main foyer entrance, and Thomas saw his long red coat vanishing into the dark. And his destination was clear: the smokehouse. Thomas reached for the sending stone and called everyone back underground. Whatever business the Skinner had, it wasn't part of the evening's program. The party was officially over. The statue in the sunroom slid aside once more, revealing the dark stairwell that led back into the passages. They regrouped in the quiet, cold dark, having avoided alarms and detection. Thomas didn't linger on the dinner, didn't walk them through the parry and politics of what he'd learned. There wasn't time. He told them the only thing that mattered: Flint was heading to the abattoir. They moved quickly through the underground halls, invisibility already starting to wear thin. Frizz whispered the warning: the magic wouldn't hold much longer. They had minutes, moments really, before they'd be seen. Above them, the world was dancing. The thunderous chords of Amadeus von Halen rumbled through floor and foundation like distant siege drums, his voice soaring through 3 octaves in a single line, launching into another irreverent retelling of the half-centaur who was really just a horse. The guests above were laughing, clapping, clinking glasses. Below, door came into view, cracked open, the faintest flicker of torchlight spilling out. Voices inside, muffled, heavy. They crept closer, keeping to the walls, behind crates, through the black like hunters tracking something that shouldn't be hunted. The door gave way at the lightest touch, and no creak, no catch, just entry. Inside the room, Thaddeus Flint stood at the centre, red coat folded over a chair, sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing the branded skull etched into the flesh of his forearm. The mark of the phantom. Knives clung to his chest and arms in sheaths and slings, each one different, no two of the same make. The party slipped in, unseen, staying low behind crates, shadowed alcoves, piles of burlap and bone. They dared not breathe. Before Flint, bound to a chair, was the younger banker. His eyes were wide and wet, his hair dishevelled, face pale beneath the torchlight. He'd been gagged, and though no blood had yet been drawn, panic sweat clung to his skin. Flint was speaking, calm, steady, the voice of a man explaining a technique, not issuing a threat. He spoke of horses. He said the banker's love of horses reminded him of his younger self, a young rancher, wild and bright-eyed, full of promise and pride. But that was before the name, before the knife. Then, Flint asked if the boy knew what they called him now, and why. He produced a blade, small and curved, and twirled it once with practiced fingers. The banker thrashed and screamed behind the gag, his voice a garbled mess of pleading. Flint didn't raise his voice. He calmly stated that no one would hear him, not over Amadeus von Halen. Flint pulled the gag, and the banker gasped. Words rushed out, but no one above would hear them. Flint reminded him, quietly, that to everyone else he'd taken his prized horse for a ride, and that the plains, well, they were dangerous places, full of wild things, and hungry ones. Flint continued, flipping the knife hand to hand, musing that if a prized cow went missing, like a chief comptroller, said the Skinner, that people would ask questions. But he added coldly, that if a little greedy piggy like him went missing, he paused. Well, that was probably just the price of doing business in the East. Flint stepped forward, and his knife touched the soft flesh at the base of the banker's pinky. The Skinner said he would be asking him some questions now, and that beneath the skin, people always found the truth. Once you were skinned, he said, there was nowhere left to hide. The knife slid in, barely a nick with great precision, just enough to part the skin beneath the pinky joint. The banker shrieked, the sound ragged and high, echoing softly through the chamber. But it was swallowed just as quickly by the roaring chords of Amadeus von Halen somewhere far above. Flint didn't react to the scream. He asked about the quick steel tourney, the money behind it, the competitors, the wages, why it had been offered to him, and asked who at Harken knew he couldn't turn it down. The banker blubbered he wasn't one of the organisers, not really. He was just the accounting officer. He managed ledgers, tallies, permits, and building costs. He didn't know who was betting what or why. He just filed the numbers. The words tumbled out of him in desperate chains, too fast to lie. Flint listened, but the blade didn't stop, and it slid in again, deeper now, angled just enough to slice near bone. This time, Flint asked about the fleet. Why the bank was investing in the fleet, why they were paying dock fees out west, what interest Central had in overseas funding, what was coming, and when. The boy was sobbing now, sweat pouring down his face, his back arched against the chair's bindings. He screamed again, but the knife pressed just enough to keep him present, not unconscious. Thomas watched from the shadows, heart hammering. Zirath listened in about the fleet, but the boy didn't seem to know anything. Zora's fists clenched, jaw tight. His instincts burned. Either the boy was telling the truth, or he was giving a performance worthy of Inkwell's stages. The Skinner, unfazed, shifted to his last question. His gold. Why the bank was delaying, why his funds hadn't cleared, who was holding what, who gave the orders. The banker begged. He swore again that he was just good at sums, had gone to the best schools, could calculate compound interest blindfolded, but knew nothing of policy or hoarding. He was slurring from the pain and shock. Flint smiled faintly. A thin flap of skin now hung from the pinky. He drew the blade back slowly, wiped it on the banker's shirt, and then, without pause, grabbed the flap and in a single violent motion tore it free of the bone like a ripped glove. The boy convulsed and the chair rattled as blood began to pool below. Then Flint turned and he kicked open a wooden case beside the chair with a sharp crack, revealing a row of glass flasks, stoppered and lined up. He pulled one free, removed the stopper, and slapped the banker hard across the face. The boy gasped, dazed. Flint pinched the banker's nose shut, forced the bottle to his now opened lips, and poured the liquid down. The gag reflex hit, but not fast enough. The boy swallowed. Suddenly the screams stopped and his breathing steadied. And as the blood congealed and pulled back, the pinky stump sealed over. No bone, no tear. Just new, pink flesh, where the old had been. Celia's eyes went wide as she understood immediately. He would do this over and over. It was about breaking him, again and again and again. The Skinner loomed above the battered banker, the glint of a dozen blades still catching firelight across his chest. He seemed almost gentle now, the storm receding into near kindness. As he reached for the gag, he murmured that the chief comptroller likely wouldn't come looking. The boy, said Flint, had no friends at Harken Bank. The gag went back in and the boy whimpered. Flint stood tall, smoothed his sleeves, and declared that he had guests to rejoin. But he'd return. There were still questions to be asked after all, and 10 little piggies left to squeal. With that, he stepped through the door, footsteps fading into the stone. The party froze in place, pressed behind crates and pillars, hearts pounding so loudly they seemed to echo. Flint's boots passed within arm's reach of Zora. Only when the door shut behind him did anyone exhale. They whispered quickly, weighing options, watching the edges of the invisibility spell begin to shimmer. Frizz, ever attuned to the weave, gave the warning. It would fall in minutes. There was no time for debate. Zirath stepped forward. One quiet breath, then he deactivated his moonstone circlet and the illusion fell. He stepped fully into view directly before the broken banker, who jolted as though struck. Eyes wide, chest rising and falling in sharp staccato bursts. Zirath raised a hand, calm and open, and he told the boy to breathe. saying he might be able to help. That tone of quiet confidence, the paladin's command wrapped in sympathy, seemed to land. This was not Zirath's first time putting someone to question. Colour returned to the banker slightly, but the colour vanished again as the price, the paladin quoted, was just a question or two. The boy mumbled, gag in place, eyes darting. He managed to get out. "They will kill me." Zirath nodded slowly, then reminded the boy simply that he'd seen his rather unique face now, and left that hand like an axe overhead. The boy hesitated, and Zirath asked something different. Not about the tourney or about the gold, but instead what he might know about the Darkwood project. Zirath and Zora had seen references to it at the Silkfang Lounge, and here it was again. Visibly, the word Darkwood struck something deep. Zirath saw it instantly. The banker flinched, not physically, but behind the eyes, something primal, relaying panic and knowledge. He knew something, and before anything more could be said, the air shimmered. The sound was so faint it barely registered. Behind the banker a figure appeared, slender, gleaming of polished chrome and sharp golden joints, materializing from thin air. Its blade was already drawn. Then 5 more appeared, surrounding the chamber like silver ghosts, seamless, silent, all facing Zirath. Celia shifted, breath caught, ready to strike first, but Zora was faster. His whisper cut the air like a drawn bowstring, stopping her with a soft, "Don't." Zirath, reading the scene the same way, raised his hands slowly and took a single step back. The automatons didn't move for him. They didn't need to. They had not come for the party. The automaton behind the boy raised its blade, and smooth as silk, the sword plunged through his chest with such grace it barely made a sound. The banker gasped. His eyes went wide, and then still. The automaton held its position for a breath, drew back the sword, and in unison all 6 vanished, disappearing like mist into the dark. Zirath turned, his face grim, and spoke loud enough for all of them to hear. This caper was over, and it was time to leave the Skinners' ranch. The escape was far less elegant than the entry. Where the infiltration had been silence and precision, the exfiltration was a dead sprint, boots pounding earth, lungs burning, the adrenaline of close calls and dead men fresh on their minds. They spilled from the secret passage in the windmill one after another, emerging into the night air from beneath the Skinners' halls. They didn't pause or speak. They cleared the outer fields in streaks of shadow, vaulting over low stone fences, ducking beneath bramble and brush, tearing their way back toward the rise where they'd first observed the manse hours earlier. The farther they got, the fainter the sound became, until Amadeus von Halen's thunderous chords were little more than echoes over the plains, swallowed by the wind. The dogs didn't bark, the guards didn't see, and even the gods, perhaps, weren't watching. Their invisibility started to flicker until one by one it dropped. By the time they reached the final slope and dropped into a narrow ravine to catch their breath, the enchantments were gone. They'd come away with a trove, an immovable rod, rare and powerful, an ancient gnomish map of hidden tinker strongholds, Flint's private ledgers deciphered, the knowledge that the bank's gold was running late, concerning to some in the bank and some outside of it, and that Flint himself had far deeper stakes in the Darkwood Road project than anyone outside the baronial elite seemed to know. Flint had tried to get his gold back from the bank, and it wasn't working. But it was what they hadn't expected that weighed heaviest. The automatons, 6 of them perfectly hidden and highly lethal. They looked nearly identical to those guarding the suites, and those that had responded to the bank alarm earlier in the day, they'd just appeared and killed, and now, in the quiet dark, the party argued. Because if one of those things had been in the warehouse with Celia earlier, that meant they'd been searching the compound as well. So was it the bank? Was it Flint? Was it both? Did Harken place constructs in their most sensitive rooms, always invisible? Were they also at the bank earlier? Were they the banker's shadows, guardians, or lethal protectors of secrets? And if they were always watching, how many secrets had already been lost? The discussion grew heated. Tempers frayed. Everyone had a theory, and no one liked what any of them meant. Something had the gold and resources to reach all the way east into hidden tunnels. Celia, silent through most of it, reached into her coat and withdrew a slim silver ring of keys. Without flourish or speech, she held them up in the moonlight. One of them shimmered. The crystal key, arcane, precise, and unmistakably marked, may very well grant them access to the exclusive velvet suites into the Chief Comptroller's quarters. Celia stated simply that the Chief Comptroller wouldn't know his key was missing for another while, and wouldn't be back at the hotel for even longer. They all knew it was now or never. By the time they crossed back into the torchlit heart of Tannertown, the manor had become a far-off fever dream, and the hotel loomed like a mirage, warm, golden, and just out of reach. The moon was high overhead, fat and judging, as exhaustion began to creep through their limbs like cold water up the spine. 20 hours. They had been running, infiltrating, dodging blades and balancing lies, long past what anyone could reasonably call endurance. But there was one play left on the board. The Chief Comptroller's key. They clustered near the shadow of a lamppost and formed a plan. Voices low, posture casual, nerves anything but. Zora and Celia would go in. Together they made for a good team, muscle and healing. Thomas whispered a small charm, his fingers dancing with arcane flourish. A subtle shimmer ran across Zora's leathers and linens, dulling the barbarian's edge just enough to make him look more like a visiting merchant lord than a battle-scarred wild magic barbarian. Zirath noted they had no idea which room was the comptroller's. Friz said she had an idea, left it at that, and told Zora and Celia to get upstairs. They didn't have time to argue, and for all they knew, the jig was up at Skinner's compound. Friz, Zirath and Thomas would hold the ground floor, engaging the concierge staff with charming distractions, sudden needs, exaggerated complaints, and suspiciously complicated drink orders. The goal was to keep eyes away from the stairs. The hotel was still humming with energy. Music floated faintly from the lounge. Glasses clinked. The tournament crowd hadn't yet gone to bed. Zora and Celia moved toward the velvet-carpeted staircase with the pace of bored aristocracy. Ahead stood two automatons, tall, slender constructs of gold and silver filigree, carved like living sculptures and thrumming with arcane life. Their eyes flickered faintly, casting pale light. As Zora and Celia approached, the constructs turned toward them in perfect unison. The metallic arcane voice that followed was both polite and devoid of warmth, welcomed the patrons, and kindly asked to present their key for exclusive access to the luxurious velvet suites. For half a second everything stopped and Celia's stomach sank. What if the key was bound to the comptroller's aura? What if it required a spoken code? What if... Zora raised the key, glinting in the light. The automatons turned their heads toward it, and their eyes blazed red. Inside them something spun, clicked, charged. Their blood pumped. The machines weren't moving an inch. Then, a soft bell. The eyes shifted, from red to green. The sound of internal mechanisms locking into place echoed like a held breath being released. The automatons bowed, welcoming them to the velvet suites. "Please," said the slender arcane agent, "enjoy your stay." It dawned on Zora they had just seen such automatons, nearly identical, under Skinner's manse. He didn't move until Celia's fingers found his wrist. And so they walked slowly and smoothly, fighting the urge to dash up the grand staircase. The third caper was on. The staircase wound upward, rising through finer and finer layers of Tannertown's hidden wealth, each turn bringing them deeper into luxury. The carpet thickened until even their breath felt muffled, and the air carried hints of lavender and polished brass, mixing strangely with the scent of oil from the automatons below. Zora and Celia moved without speaking, keeping a steady pace, knowing well that confidence could needed to make up for not belonging. The higher they climbed, the more intricate the architecture became. Even the handrails had been wrapped in fine leather, stitched tight and reinforced with brass, a detail meant only for the touch of the elite. At the top of the staircase, past one last sweeping turn, they reached a door unlike any other. There was no knob, no latch, just a seamless face of dark wood inlaid with ivory, its only marking the words "Velvet Sweets," carved with precise elegance. Without a touch or whisper, the door opened on its own. Behind it stood another red-eyed automaton, hands behind its back, standing lithe as a blade. Back in the warm-lit atrium of the Grand Hotel, a different kind of quiet operation was unfolding beneath the chandeliers. As Celia and Zora vanished up the staircase, Frizz, Thomas and Zirath moved to secure the final piece of the puzzle. The comptroller's room number. Frizz was already fishing through her satchel, producing parchment, ink, a pressed envelope, and her ever-faithful quill. She murmured something about urgency, and that was enough to get Thomas's brow raised. Zirath, watching her scrawl with brisk elegance, remarked, only half amused, that she could just as easily tell the staff what she wanted, rather than spell it out. Frizz, without pausing, clarified that this wasn't instructions and it was bait. Her intention was simple: write something urgent, seal it with convincing formality, and ask that it be delivered straight to the room of the chief comptroller. And then, just as the concierge thought about the number, she would cast a quick detect thoughts. Thomas blinked slowly, offering a grudging nod. There were moments when Frizz's mind seemed like it belonged in a different sort of theatre entirely, one with fewer books and far more sabotage. He looked across the front counter, quickly sizing up the concierge staff. His insight told him the third one from the left stood straighter than the others, wore a better-fitted waistcoat, and handled a noblewoman's complaint with such calm detachment that Thomas would have bet a year's profits on him being the one who knew exactly which high roller slept where. Zirath gave a quiet nod, his way of saying, "This is the plan, and the plan is sound." Frizz signed the letter with a flourish that no one could possibly decipher, folded it crisply, and moved toward the concierge. The concierge took the envelope, a flicker of focus crossing his features. He read the name, blinked, and his eyes narrowed briefly, just enough for Frizz to reach in. The spell touched the surface of his thoughts, and there it was, the number. The man tucked the envelope neatly under his arm, promising swift delivery. Frizz offered a rushed and grateful thank you, then turned on her heel, gripping her sending stone with urgency. 777, the high roller suite. She hoped it wasn't too late. Back in the luxury of the hotel's highest floors, the automaton standing beyond was slender as a rapier and still as death, and it watched them enter with eyes that burned a quiet red. There was no bow, no gesture, just the measured tilt of its head as it took them in like a ledger taking inventory. The voice that issued from it was smoother than the others, colder, and it asked to see their key, not as a request, but as a prelude to judgment. Zora raised the crystal pass, calm in posture, though not in pulse. The construct's eyes pulsed brighter, and something within its chest began to hum. Celia put her weight on her back foot, readying. The moment stretched, taut and brittle, before the red eyes blinked green with a soft mechanical chirp. The automaton bowed and stepped aside to let them pass, stating in perfect formality that they were to enjoy their stay. They walked forward, careful to keep their pace slow, though every part of them wanted to sprint for the cover of shadow. The hallway ahead was silent, its walls wrapped in velvet, its doors unmarked and indistinct, each one identical to the next. There was no numbering system, no sign to guide them, just a string of expensive secrets lining the corridor like pearls on a noose. Behind them, the automaton resumed its stance at the threshold, folding its hands behind its back once more. It wasn't following them, but neither had it stopped watching. They still hadn't received the room number from the others. There was no way to know which door was the one they needed. Celia tilted her head ever so slightly toward Zora, her expression unreadable in the low light. There were too many doors, not enough time, and a machine behind them watched. They had to walk forward slowly. The sending stone came alive and they had their lucky number. Celia and Zora moved briskly but carefully through the upper corridor, guided by the soft gleam of gold-enamelled signs that curved with the hallway's opulent design. The carpeting was thick and forgiving, and the quiet felt almost pressurized, as though even the air had been instructed to keep secrets. They turned right at the corner, heading toward the high roller suite, marked only by its placement and polish, and not by any number or name. The hallway remained mercifully empty, and the automaton at the door below hadn't followed. When they reached the final door, Celia lifted the crystal key and pressed it against a matching inset crystal in the wood. There was no audible click, but a soft unlocking echoed somewhere within the wall, and the latch released. The suite welcomed them with silence. They stepped in lightly and took stock. The suite had an entrance hall, a richly furnished bedroom, a pristine washroom, and, through a half-open door, a study that appeared more utilized than decorated. That was where they found what they were looking for. The rooms were flawless, not in extravagance, but in symmetry. Every cushion, lamp, and folded cloth was precisely placed, and the angles between furniture seemed measured by rule rather than preference. Neither Zora nor Celia needed to speak the shared understanding between them. Whoever lived here would know if something had been moved even slightly. The study was compact but efficient. A broad desk faced a set of shuttered windows, and on it a beautiful and complex abacus, with a dozen tiers made from ivory, jade, silver, and gold. Next to it were two ledgers, large and finely bound. The leather was dyed deep burgundy and embossed with the sigil of Harken Bank. The locks were a wonder, constructed from layers of interlocking golden gears, mounted with rotating dials and tiny arcane mechanisms. No visible keyhole could be found, and the locks pulsed faintly with protective enchantments. Celia approached them slowly while Zora stood watch near the door, but they both reached the same conclusion. The ledgers weren't meant to be pried open by force, and any tampering might erase their contents. This wasn't something either of them could solve. They needed Frizz. And now they had a choice to make. Back on the ground floor, the trio slipped out of the lobby without ceremony. There was no need for a dramatic exit, as one by one they passed through the doors and out into the night air. The streets were still, lit by soft lantern light and painted with long shadows. Each of them peeled off toward a different side of the building. The upper floor of the Velvet Fang was high and narrow, with windows facing only 3 sides, so they each chose a vantage point where they could see the highest windows clearly and act fast if needed. Frizz took the southern edge near the quiet side alley where wagons made early morning deliveries. Thomas circled toward the eastern side, placing himself behind a line of potted shrubs that obscured the edge of the garden wall. Zirath took the northern flank, standing beneath the sloping awning of a shuttered tailor's shop, arms folded in the dark. None of them spoke. There was nothing left to coordinate. The plan had been made. Frizz looked up, eyes scanning the suite windows above. Her fingers hovered near the components for the spell, and the runes in her mind were already coalescing. She wouldn't cast until she saw movement, but the slow fall was ready to release the moment it was needed. The street for now remained quiet, not eerily so, just late. The city had curled into itself for the night, and even the usual drift of distant tavern noise seemed to fade beneath the weight of what they'd seen. Each of them took stock. No moving shadows, no strange shapes in the windows, no sudden shifts in wind. So far everything appeared calm, and with no signal from above they held their breath and waited, knowing full well that this was likely the last time they'd walk out of the Velvet Fang Hotel. Upstairs, in the silence of velvet and oil-lamped shadow, the choice had been made. Celia and Zora stood before the twin ledgers. Whatever was locked inside, be it names, numbers, bribes, or truths, it was more than they could crack here. And leaving it behind was unthinkable. They would take them. The tinker might protest, might demand coin or favours or madness, but if anyone could open a vault without a key, it was him. As Celia moved to tuck the ledgers carefully into her pack, Zora placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Not rough, not panicked, just a suggestion. If they were already stealing something, if the balance had already tipped, what else might be useful? They moved through the suite with purpose. Nothing was disturbed, no drawers rifled, no cushions upended. They searched with the restraint of professionals, eyes tracing edges, fingers brushing just close enough. It was Zora who noticed the case, plain on first glance but too deliberately placed and far too pristine. Carved wood, polished to a glassy sheen, with Harken Bank pressed into the top in soft gold leaf. Not gaudy, official. They opened it. Inside were several fitted compartments, lined in deep felt. Most were empty, but one still held a small pouch. Leather, embossed, stamped with the same mark. Celia knew it for what it was almost immediately: a transfer kit. She had seen similar bags used by the healing houses, often in the hands of senior clerics moving field hand wages between rural outposts. It wasn't just a bag, it was a bank-certified bag of holding, optimized for the transport of gold, gems, and other high-value currencies. Celia glanced to Zora, who nodded, and the pouch joined the ledgers in the bag. They were done. They reached the window, intent on slipping out and casting Frizz's slow-fall spell to drift down into the arms of the waiting street. But the windows here weren't designed to open. There were no hinges, no seams, just thick crystal-clear panes sunk deep into their ornate wooden frames. Breaking them would sound like a bell tower. There was no choice, and they'd have to leave the way they came. Resolute, they calmly stepped into the hallway, soft-footed and quick, and immediately froze. The automaton was there, and it hadn't followed them, hadn't patrolled. It had simply waited. At the far end of the hall, its polished body gleamed beneath the low lanterns, and its red eyes cast narrow beams across the floor. It stood motionless, blocking their path. They moved forward, slow and steady, inching their way past locked doors and velvet tapestries, eyes forward and pulse pounding. The automaton did not move at 12 feet 10, 6'2". Zora's hand drifted to the hilt hidden beneath Thomas's enchanted illusion. Celia's fingers closed around the sending stone. If it struck, if it sensed, they wouldn't be able to keep it quiet. Then ping. The eyes blinked green, offered a cold but perfectly phrased farewell as it pivoted aside, and thanked them both for their valued patronage. The illusion still held. Celia and Zora turned their aborted gestures into small waves, smiled with mechanical grace, and passed. Down the stairs they went, hearts thudding behind their ribs. Each floor they cleared was a floor farther from danger. The exit was just ahead. The desk, the lobby, the doors. Then suddenly they were outside, out in the cool street and under open sky. We end our tale today with our party having crafted, conducted, and concluded, in one wild day, 3 capers in Tannertown. Until next time, fellow adventurers.